Hi there, in this video I'm going to show you how you can compare two different files in Alteryx, particularly if you're on a project where you have to do some quality assurance or make sure that you've built the right thing. This is a great thing to be able to do. And I think Alteryx is just one of the tools that does this really nice and easy. So I've got two files within Alteryx on the canvas already. One has some quality issues, the other one is perfectly fine. So how would you go about finding out what the problem is with file number 2? Well, I'm going to show you my favorite way to do it. There are, of course, more ways to do it. What I always like to do is I bring in a transpose tool first. And the reason for the transpose tool is it's going to pivot all the data. Now, I haven't shown you the data yet, but what it is you effectively have some names of courses. So there's some IDs in there, some name of courses on Udemy, and some various ratings and so on. But the only thing that really matters for me is this unique ID. So I'm going to group the data by that unique ID, and all the other data I want to pivot as rows. And the reason I'm going to do that is so that it's nice and easy to compare. So I'll quickly show you what the results of that looks like. And you can immediately see that there are at least 4 rows difference between that, but I give away the answer a little bit on rows, but that's just useful to know when we get to that comparison later on. The first thing I'm going to do is not actually look for those missing rows. What I'm going to do is look for missing columns. So where do we have names of columns in one that is not in the other, if at all? And we don't know that yet when we've just got a new 2 sets of files. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to get the unique columns in each. So that's the column name. And I'm just going to copy this and do the same. And then I will use a join tool to be able to say, do I have the same names in both files? And we're simply going to join name to name. What are the differences? I'll just press Ctrl Shift and B to get all those browsers, and then we can see on both the right and the left what are the differences. So we see 17 records over here, 19 over there, and 2 records. These are the 2 columns that are in file 1 that are not in file 2. So there we already have a useful piece of information. We know that here are file 2 columns that are missing. So we can label this in our workflow. But the one thing we haven't done is identify any rows or values that might be different between the 2 files. So what we're going to do right now is going to go get the actual rows from file 1. But what I want to do is I want to make sure I do that for where the columns match between the data. So I'm going to use the output from this join, which is all the matching columns. I only want to compare those two because I already know that there will be columns that will have data that won't be in both because the columns were missing. So now I just want to compare whether there are identical columns. I want to compare the name with the name, and I don't need any of this data. I just want to say pull through all the relevant columns that we know are in both. And what we want to do immediately after that is saying, okay, for that data, I want to compare that with file number 2. So where the columns are the same, I want to immediately compare the ID. Do we have the same ID in both? Oh, this join, apologies, should be from here. So we're going to say the ID needs to match the other ID. The column name needs to match. We won't match on the value yet. We're simply now looking for rows that are different. And again, I'll press Ctrl Shift and B, run that through. And what we should now get is if there's any mismatch, that this should only be the rows that are different. So we see 68 values that are different. But you notice that it repeats, of course, for every ID, because every column value would be different if the row itself was missing. So to explain that a little better, if I just group by the unique ID, what we should get back is that 4 rows we saw at the start, to say, okay, great, so we can now finally find those 4 rows that are different between these 2 file sets. So now we have our rows identified that are different as well, and we can label this output as well, and this is the file 2 rows that are missing. And finally, the one thing we haven't done is where the IDs and the columns actually matched, are the values always the same? Now in big data sets, you will always find that this is hard to obviously scroll through to find differences. So what we can simply do here in Alteryx, because we've now pivoted the data, and this is one of the reasons it's my favorite way to do it, is now it's really easy to just use a filter tool to identify, show me all the cases where the value does not equal, and we have to use the custom formula to type in the right value, so the other field name, and just give me back those values, and if they exist at all. And when this runs through, we see that there are only 2 cases from about 23,000 where we have differences where there's a value in file 1 but no value in file 2. And what you can do when you do a report and you see values like this, you can decide how you want to create your final report. I'm not going to create a final report now. I simply want to point out what I like to do is create something like a reason column. So to document these reasons, something like these are file 2, these are differences between file 1 and 2. It could have been different on either side, and it's just coincidental in this case that it always is on file 2 that there's a problem, but in normal situations it could have been on either side. So when you do that, and if you do that for every step and you document you can say a reason here could be columns is missing from file 2, kind of like we said over here, and the same for rows that are missing from file 2. When you run this through, you have a nice reason describing the difference between the 2 files as well. You just aggregate that up and you can decide how much detail you want to put into your reports, but then you have a nice reason as well. So in this way, Alteryx helps you identify differences between files in a nice and easy way, and I personally think when you've got big data sets, it's a lot harder to do in any other tool like SQL and Excel. Hope that was helpful to you. Have a wonderful day, and if you've got any comments, feel free to leave them down below.